There is a very specific kind of silence that follows the moment someone declines an avoidance offer of friendship after ending things romantically, and that silence rarely means what it initially appears to mean. Most people expect relief on the avoidance side, expect the rejection of friendship to be received as one less obligation, one less complicated tie to manage. What actually tends to happen underneath that composed exterior is something far more destabilizing, because the offer of friendship was almost never really about friendship in the first place. It was about maintaining access, about keeping a foothold in another person's life without having to fully reckon with the loss of it. When that foothold gets removed, cleanly and without negotiation, something shifts in the avoidant that they rarely see coming and even more rarely admit to anyone, including themselves. If the listener has ever declined this kind of offer, wondering whether it was too harsh, too final, too dismissive of what might have been a genuine gesture, this exploration is going to walk through exactly what tends to happen next and why that decision carries far more weight than it might have felt like it carried in the moment. To understand why declining friendship lands so differently than most people expect, it helps to understand what the offer typically represents from the avoidance side. Avoidants often struggle profoundly with clean endings. Full closure requires confronting loss directly, sitting with the finality of no longer having access to someone, absorbing the discomfort of a door closing completely, rather than staying propped open through some alternative arrangement. Friendship, offered in the immediate aftermath of a breakup, frequently functions as exactly this kind of propped door, a way of softening the finality without having to name that softening as anything other than maturity, kindness, or evolved emotional intelligence. The avoidant tells themselves, and often tells the other person, that staying friends reflects how much they respect what existed between them. Underneath that story, more often than not, is something simpler and less flattering, an inability to tolerate the full weight of the ending. This is worth naming plainly for the listener who has sat across from an avoidant proposing friendship and felt something instinctively off about the offer, even without being able to articulate exactly why. That instinct was likely accurate. Friendship offered this way rarely emerges from a place of genuine platonic interest in continuing the relationship in a new form. It emerges from discomfort with absence, a discomfort the avoidant has spent their entire life avoiding through whatever means available, and friendship becomes simply the latest available means, dressed up in language that sounds generous but functions, underneath, as avoidance of the very closure the breakup was supposed to represent. When someone declines this offer, when they say clearly that they need space, that friendship isn't something they can or want to maintain right now or possibly ever, they are doing something the avoidance psychology has almost no framework for processing. They are closing the door the avoidant was quietly counting on staying open. And because the avoidant rarely consciously recognizes how much they were relying on that door, the reaction to its closing often surprises even them, arriving as a wave of unexpected grief, unexpected anxiety, sometimes even unexpected anger, none of which maps cleanly onto what they'd expect to feel about a friendship they claimed, moments earlier, to view as optional. It's worth exploring what specifically gets triggered inside an avoidant when this kind of clean refusal happens, because it touches something deeper than simple disappointment. For most of the avoidance life, relationships have ended in one of two ways. Either they were the one who initiated the distance, maintaining a sense of control over the pace and terms of separation, or the relationship simply faded without a clear moment of finality, drifting into vague, ambiguous territory that never required direct confrontation. A firm decline of friendship represents neither of these familiar patterns. It's decisive, it's final. And critically, it's a decision made entirely by someone else. Someone the avoidant does not get to manage, negotiate with, or slowly wear down through persistence or charm. This loss of control over the terms of the ending is often what produces the disproportionate emotional response that follows, far more than any genuine mourning of the friendship itself. There's a particular kind of confrontation embedded in this refusal that deserves careful examination, because it forces the avoidant to encounter something they've spent considerable energy avoiding throughout the relationship. The reality that another person has boundaries the avoidant cannot simply talk their way around. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant may have grown accustomed to a certain amount of flexibility from their partner, a willingness to extend patience, to accept vague explanations, to interpret withdrawal charitably rather than confronting it directly. The decline of friendship represents the first moment, sometimes in the entire relationship's history, where the other person draws a line and holds it without softening, without negotiating, without leaving room for the avoidant's usual strategies of charm or reassurance to work their way back in. This is worth sitting with directly for anyone who is worried that declining friendship was somehow cruel, somehow an overreaction to what might have seemed like a reasonable, even generous offer. Holding a boundary that someone else cannot negotiate their way around is not cruelty. It is one of the clearest, most direct forms of self-respect available in the aftermath of a relationship that likely required considerable self-erasure to sustain in the first place. The discomfort this boundary produces in the avoidant is not evidence that the boundary was wrong. It is evidence that the boundary is doing exactly what boundaries are meant to do, which is create consequence where none previously existed. It's worth exploring the specific psychological mechanism through which this refusal begins to unravel some of the avoidant's usual defenses. Much of an avoidant's sense of security depends on believing they retain some degree of access or influence over people who have mattered to them, even after a relationship ends. This isn't necessarily about wanting the relationship back in its previous form. It's about maintaining a kind of emotional insurance policy, a sense that the connection, however altered, still exists in some accessible form, should the avoidant ever want or need to draw on it. A firm decline of friendship cancels this insurance policy entirely. There's no accessible form left. The connection, as far as the other person is concerned, has genuinely ended, and the avoidant is left to reckon with a finality they had quietly assumed they'd never actually have to face. This reckoning often produces a specific and uncomfortable kind of self-examination, one that many avoidants manage to avoid for years, simply because their relationships rarely end with this degree of clarity. Confronted with a full, unambiguous ending, the avoidant is forced to consider the relationship as a complete, closed narrative, rather than an ongoing, unresolved thread that friendship could have kept perpetually open. This completeness invites a kind of retrospective honesty that ambiguity always managed to prevent. Without the comfortable fiction of eventual reconnection, without the soft cushioning of remaining friends, the avoidant has to sit with the relationship exactly as it was, including their own role in how it ended, without any remaining possibility of quietly revising that story through future contact. There's something worth naming here about how differently this experience unfolds compared to what the avoidant likely expected when they made the friendship offer in the first place. Many avoidants extend this offer with genuine, if unexamined, confidence that it will be accepted because acceptance has so often followed similar offers in the past, whether in this relationship or in previous ones. Declining the offer disrupts an established pattern the avoidant has come to rely on without fully realizing how central that pattern was to their sense of relational safety. This disruption alone can trigger a cascade of unfamiliar emotional responses. Confusion about why this particular ending feels so much harder to metabolize than others. Restlessness that has no obvious explanation. A persistent low-grade unease that resists easy resolution because its actual source, the loss of an emotional safety net the avoidant didn't know they were counting on, remains largely unconscious. It's worth exploring too how this refusal interacts with the avoidant's broader relationship to rejection generally, because rejection functions very differently for someone whose defenses are built around avoiding vulnerability than it does for people with more secure relational patterns. For an avoidant, being rejected, especially being rejected clearly and without room for negotiation, often triggers old wounds related to earlier experiences of feeling unworthy of continued connection. Wounds that may have nothing directly to do with the current relationship, but that get reactivated by any experience of unambiguous refusal. This means the intensity of the avoidant's reaction to a declined friendship offer frequently has less to do with how much the friendship itself actually mattered to them, and more to do with older, unresolved material the refusal happens to touch. For the listener who has experienced this exact dynamic, watching an avoidant respond with surprising intensity to what should have been, by their own earlier framing, a low-stakes offer, there's something important worth understanding about what that intensity actually reveals. It reveals that the offer was never as low stakes as it was presented to be. It reveals that beneath the composed language of mature, evolved friendship existed a genuine, if unacknowledged, need to maintain some form of continued access, and that need was significant enough to produce real disruption once denied. This doesn't mean the friendship offer was manipulative in any deliberate sense. Most avoidants aren't consciously strategizing when they make these offers. But it does mean the offer carried more emotional weight for the avoidant than the casual framing suggested, and declining it accordingly carries more weight in response than a simple, low-stakes rejection would. There's a particular kind of respect embedded in choosing to decline this offer honestly rather than accepting it out of guilt, obligation, or a desire to avoid seeming harsh, and this respect extends in multiple directions simultaneously. It respects the person declining, protecting them from a dynamic that would likely require continued emotional labor, continued management of someone else's need for access, continued suppression of their own need for full closure in service of maintaining a connection they may not actually want to maintain. It also, somewhat counterintuitively, respects the avoidant more than accepting the offer typically would, because it denies them the opportunity to avoid a reckoning they genuinely need to face in order to grow. Accepting friendship out of obligation would simply extend the avoidant's ability to avoid confronting the relationship's true ending, delaying whatever internal work that confrontation might eventually prompt. It's worth considering what tends to happen for an avoidant over the longer arc of time following this kind of clean refusal, because the initial disruption, however intense, rarely represents the whole story. In the immediate aftermath, confusion and discomfort tend to dominate, sometimes accompanied by attempts to renegotiate the boundary through indirect contact, casual check-ins framed as concern, or occasional messages designed to test whether the refusal was truly final. When these attempts consistently meet the same clear response, something eventually begins to shift. The avoidant is forced, slowly and often reluctantly, to accept that some endings genuinely are final, that not every relationship can be preserved in some diminished, accessible form, simply because preserving it would be more comfortable for them. This acceptance, when it eventually arrives, often marks a meaningful, if quiet, turning point in how the avoidant approaches future relationships and future endings. Having encountered a boundary that could not be negotiated around, having sat with the discomfort of a genuinely closed door rather than a conveniently propped open one, some avoidants begin to develop a more honest relationship with the concept of loss itself, one that doesn't depend on maintaining partial access as a buffer against full acknowledgement. This growth, when it happens, is rarely visible to the person whose refusal made it possible. It unfolds privately, applied most often to future relationships, rather than offered back as gratitude or acknowledgement to the person who first drew the boundary that made it necessary. There's a subtler dimension worth exploring here, concerning the specific role that mutual friends and shared social circles play in how this refusal echoes beyond the two people directly involved. Avoidants who propose friendship after a breakup are often, whether consciously or not, thinking about more than just the direct relationship with their former partner. They're thinking about how the ending will be perceived by everyone around them, about maintaining an image of amicability that protects their reputation within a shared community. When friendship is offered and accepted, this image gets preserved almost automatically. The story becomes one of maturity and mutual respect, and the avoidant rarely has to account for their own role in whatever difficulty preceded the breakup. When friendship is declined, particularly if that decline becomes visible to the wider social circle, the avoidant loses this protective narrative entirely. People start to wonder why. Questions arise that the avoidant cannot control or fully answer without revealing more than they'd prefer to reveal, and this loss of narrative control often compounds the emotional disruption already caused by the refusal itself. This social dimension deserves particular attention because it explains why some avoidants respond to a declined friendship offer with behaviour that looks less like grief and more like damage control. Increased communication with mutual friends, subtle attempts to reframe the breakup's narrative before the other person has a chance to share their own account, occasional passive references to still being on good terms, despite clear evidence to the contrary. All of these behaviours often emerge not from genuine confusion about the boundary, but from an urgent, largely unconscious effort to manage perception in the absence of the friendship that would have made such management unnecessary. Recognizing this pattern can be clarifying for anyone who notices an avoidant behaving strangely performative in shared social settings following a firm decline, because the performance usually has less to do with the person who declined and more to do with everyone else who might be watching. It's worth examining too how this entire dynamic connects to a deeper pattern in how avoidants relate to endings across every domain of their life, not just romantic relationships. Many avoidants carry a lifelong discomfort with anything that feels permanently closed, an almost reflexive need to keep every door slightly ajar, whether that door leads back to an old relationship, an old job, an old friendship, or even an old version of themselves they've since outgrown. This isn't necessarily about wanting to walk back through any particular door. It's about the anxiety produced by a door being sealed completely, an anxiety rooted in a deeper fear of finality itself, a fear that likely predates the specific relationship being discussed here by many years, tracing back to earlier experiences where endings felt unpredictable, sudden, or entirely outside the avoidant's control. A declined friendship offer, in this light, becomes less about the specific person doing the declining and more about triggering an old, familiar fear that has shaped the avoidant's relationship to loss for most of their life. Understanding this broader pattern can help explain why the intensity of an avoidance reaction to a declined friendship so rarely matches the actual significance of the friendship itself. If the reaction were purely proportional to what was lost, a friendship that was, by the avoidant's own initial framing, optional and low stakes, the response should logically be mild, easily absorbed, quickly forgotten. Instead, the response often lingers, resurfaces unexpectedly, and produces a disproportionate amount of rumination given what was ostensibly at stake. This disproportion is itself diagnostic. It reveals that the actual object of the avoidance distress was never really the friendship. It was the confrontation with finality that declining the friendship forced into being, a confrontation the avoidant had been quietly avoiding through the very offer that got refused. There's something worth naming about how this experience differs for avoidants depending on how central control has been to their broader personality structure. Some avoidants respond to a firm decline with relatively quick acceptance, particularly those whose avoidant patterns are less deeply entrenched or whose overall capacity for emotional flexibility is stronger. Others, particularly those whose sense of security depends most heavily on maintaining control over their environment and relationships, respond with prolonged difficulty, sometimes cycling through denial, negotiation attempts, and eventual withdrawal before anything resembling acceptance actually settles in. This variation matters for the listener trying to predict or understand a specific avoidance response, because there is no single universal timeline for how this process unfolds. What remains consistent across nearly all cases, however, is that some degree of internal disruption occurs, even when it never becomes visible to anyone on the outside. It's also worth exploring the specific role that time plays in eventually resolving this disruption, because the resolution, when it happens, rarely arrives through any direct communication between the two people involved. Since contact has been declined, the avoidant has no external mechanism through which to process the ending in relation to the actual person who prompted it. Instead, resolution tends to occur entirely internally, often facilitated by new relationships, new experiences, or simply the accumulation of time and distance that gradually dulls the initial sharpness of the disruption. This internal, unwitnessed process means that even when an avoidant does eventually arrive at genuine acceptance, even when they do eventually integrate the lesson that not every relationship can or should be preserved in some diminished form, this growth happens entirely outside the awareness of the person whose boundary made it necessary in the first place. The person who set the boundary rarely receives any confirmation that it worked, that it mattered, that it prompted anything beyond initial discomfort. This absence of confirmation deserves direct acknowledgement here, because it can create a specific kind of lingering uncertainty for the person who chose to decline. Without any visible evidence that the boundary produced meaningful reflection rather than simple resentment, it becomes easy to wonder whether the decision was worth the discomfort it clearly caused, whether a softer approach, perhaps a conditional friendship with clear limits, might have achieved similar protective goals without triggering such an intense reaction. This uncertainty, while understandable, deserves gentle correction. The value of a boundary was never contingent on the other person's visible response to it, and the discomfort a boundary produces in someone who has spent their life avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation is not evidence of failure. It is often, paradoxically, the clearest evidence that the boundary was necessary in the first place. There's a final dimension worth exploring here, concerning what this refusal ultimately teaches the person who chose it about their own capacity for self-protection, independent of whatever eventually happens to the avoidant on the other side of that choice. Declining an offer that felt, in the moment, generous or even kind, requires a specific kind of clarity about one's own needs that doesn't come naturally to everyone, particularly not to anyone who has spent considerable time in a relationship structured around accommodating someone else's discomfort with vulnerability. Choosing full closure over a diminished, ongoing connection represents a genuine act of self-advocacy, one that often gets second-guessed, precisely because it defies the more socially rewarded narrative of remaining amicable, staying friends, proving that the relationship's ending didn't have to be bitter or final. There is no inherent virtue in staying connected to someone whose primary motivation for continued contact was managing their own discomfort with loss, rather than genuine platonic interest in who the other person actually is. There's one more angle worth considering here, one that speaks directly to a question many people quietly ask themselves after declining this kind of offer: whether firmness in this specific moment risks closing off the possibility of a healthier connection forming naturally further down the line, once enough time and distance have passed for old dynamics to fully dissolve. This concern is understandable, and it deserves a genuine answer rather than a dismissive one. It's true that some former partners do eventually form authentic friendships years after a breakup, once both people have had sufficient time to become different versions of themselves, versions no longer entangled in the specific patterns that made the original relationship difficult. But this kind of friendship, when it does form successfully, almost never grows out of an offer extended in the raw, immediate aftermath of a breakup. It grows instead out of genuine, separate individual healing that happens entirely independent of any ongoing contact, followed much later by an entirely new decision, made freshly, without the pressure or residue of the original ending still coloring the interaction. Declining the immediate offer, in other words, doesn't foreclose this longer-term possibility. If anything, it protects the conditions that would actually make such a possibility real rather than illusory. Accepting friendship immediately after a breakup, before either person has done any real individual work, tends to produce something that only resembles genuine friendship on the surface, while functioning underneath as an extension of unresolved relational patterns. Old roles simply relabeled with a different, more socially acceptable title. Declining creates space for something more honest to potentially develop later, precisely because it refuses to let the earlier dynamic masquerade as resolution before any real resolution has actually occurred. It's worth returning, finally, to the specific emotional labor this entire situation asks of the person doing the declining, because that labor deserves recognition independent of anything the avoidant does or doesn't eventually learn from it. Holding a boundary against someone actively working, whether consciously or not, to erode it through persistence, charm, guilt, or performed hurt, requires sustained effort, especially in the days and weeks immediately following the refusal when the pressure to reconsider often peaks. This labor doesn't announce itself as heroic in the moment. It usually just feels exhausting, uncertain, occasionally guilt-inducing, particularly for anyone whose instinct has always leaned toward accommodation rather than firmness. But sustained boundaries, held quietly and without needing external validation to justify them, represent one of the more significant forms of self-respect a person can practice. And their value doesn't depend on whether the avoidant on the other side ever comes to understand or appreciate what that boundary actually protected. For the listener sitting with the discomfort of having declined this offer, wondering whether the discomfort on both sides means something went wrong, it's worth closing with a clear reminder that discomfort and wrongness are not the same thing. The refusal of friendship, however uncomfortable it felt to deliver, and however intensely it seemed to land, was very likely one of the most honest, self-respecting choices available in that moment, one that protected space for genuine healing rather than perpetuating a dynamic built on managing someone else's difficulty with endings. Whatever growth eventually happens on the avoidance side of that boundary belongs entirely to them now, a private consequence of a decision that never needed their approval or comfort in order to have been the right one to make. What remains, long after the initial discomfort of that refusal has faded on both sides, is a quieter kind of certainty that tends to outlast any lingering doubt about how the moment was handled. Boundaries drawn honestly, even when they land hard, even when they disrupt someone else's preferred version of how an ending should unfold, rarely need retroactive justification. They simply stand on their own terms, exactly as firm and exactly as necessary as they were the day they were first spoken aloud, regardless of whether anyone else on the other side ever truly, fully understands why or needed to at all.